Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, Quality Compliance Facilitated by your Forensic Information Management System. I'm Robert Aliberta, the Director of Special Projects of LCGC and Spectroscopy, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We're pleased to bring you this webcast presented by LCGC and Spectroscopy, sponsored by LabVantage Solutions. I would like to share a statement from our sponsor. LabVantage Solutions, a recognized leader in laboratory software solutions with more than 1,500 installations worldwide, offers LabVantage Forensic Navigator, an end-to-end compliant informatics platform to serve the entire forensic lifecycle. It enables the secure collection, preservation, and analysis of forensic evidence, compliance with quality and regulations, and the dissemination of forensic data, from crime scene to legal proceedings, to support rapid resolution of cases and confidence in investigative results. We have a few important announcements before we begin. The webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You could submit the questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of the video player. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small icon in the bottom right corner of the media player. The slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the top right of your presentation window. I would now like to introduce today's speakers. We're pleased to be joined today by Mr. Bob Hilbert and Dr. Robin McDonald. Mr. Bob Hilbert is a laboratory information management industry expert with more than 30 years in LIMS industry experience related to design, construction, project management, business consultancy, implementation, training, and validation, with 15 years in senior management. He also has 16 years of experience working in a Department of Energy laboratory. Robin McDonald worked for the Broward Sheriff's Office in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, from 1996 to 2010 in trace evidence. She also managed the trace evidence, firearms, drug chemistry, and question document units, and became a 17025 technical assessor. In 2010, she was hired as the senior product manager for the forensic team at a global LIMS provider. Robin now brings her depth of industry knowledge to LabVantage, where she is a senior product manager. Thank you all for joining us today. Please get us started.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Bob Hilbert. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Robin McDonald. And as Bob told you, we're going to be talking today about quality compliance facilitated by your forensic information management system. Well, what is a forensic information management system? It really is a LIMS, or a lab information management system, that has been built with an entire focus on the forensic life cycle that includes crime scene, property, laboratory, all of the chain of custody that is critical throughout that entire process. So we will possibly use FIMS and LIMS interchangeably. Just remember that FIMS really is the one with the forensic focus. I'm not going to repeat a lot of the information you see here because Bob covered it in his introduction, but I do want to reiterate a couple of points. Robin and I both have quite a lot of years in forensics. Robin has worked in forensic laboratories for quite a long time, working on the bench and supervising 3 or 4 different units. All of my experience has been around the software building and delivery in the forensic realm. But maybe more important than any of that is that Robin and I both have quality assurance backgrounds. She is a certified ISO 17025 technical assessor, which is completely relevant to today's talk. And I was also a certified lead auditor for the Department of Energy when I worked at 2 of their laboratories over a 16-year period. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about our learning objectives for the day. First off, we want to be sure to actually review the critical and relevant requirements of ISO 17025 and other standards. Secondly, we want to talk about how a FIMS supports and facilitates your compliance with those standards. And then thirdly, we want to make sure that people understand the value of the efficiency and the time savings that can be realized by actually implementing a FIMS. Robin and I both work at LabVantage. I am the director of Government and Forensic Solutions. Robin is a senior product manager for forensics, but both of us come at everything from a product management perspective. And that's actually the department in which we work. Product management means that you don't just sit down with a bunch of your buddies and start writing code because you think that's what the forensic industry needs. And then you put a for sale sign on that package and you go ahead and start to talk to the industry and see what you didn't do right. What you do to build a comprehensive system from a product management perspective is you find out from experts in the industry what their challenges are from an automation perspective. And better yet, you can have an expert forensic PhD chemist in your own organization to make that all very clear to everyone doing the work. A key point here is the word comprehensive. We're talking about the entire forensic life cycle. I said this earlier, and it's worth repeating. It's not just laboratory. It's all of those things before and after the laboratory process. One of the problem areas is having separate systems. If you don't have a FIMS, it's time consuming and costly and often involves duplicate data entry that's hard to keep track of. Also, the manual data entry itself that's often necessitated when you don't do things like use one central database or use instrument interfaces. All of those manual entries are suspect for transcription errors. Thirdly, it's very hard to control applications like spreadsheets if you are not doing calculations inside of the FIMS. Lastly, what's really critical here is the prep time it takes to get ready for an assessment. Dr. McDonald talked about this earlier. Yes, the LIMS does help you comply. It helps you track your documentation, but a very nice benefit is being able to get ready for those audits before they occur. So why choose a FIMS? There's really 2 points on this slide. Number one, you're trying to comply with all of these related standards and some others, but more importantly than just complying, you want to be sure that these standards are being effectively applied to these parts of the life cycle. A lot of what's shown here is laboratory specific, but these are all critical steps in the process, all of which must involve quality compliance. Let's talk about quality compliance at a high level. When we talk about 17025 and 9001, it's very obvious to state those first 2 bullets, right? 9001 is the quality management standard. 17025 is the standard used by laboratories for testing and calibration. But we want to make sure that that high-level perspective is clear here because that's really the framework for this entire talk. Labs that follow both of these standards are very likely to have a solid quality system. But keep in mind, complying with one of these standards does not mean that you're complying with the other. They do overlap some in some specific areas, but you do have to address compliance, document compliance, and really be ready for assessments in either of the areas. Talking about compliance with 17025 at the bottom here, there's really 2 key components. The first component is that which you do outside of your FIMS implementation. This is things like your high-level quality management document, your policies that must be followed, not just from a management perspective, but also throughout the organization. It's not until we get to this second bullet here where we start to talk about all of the detailed requirements that can be met by working with a FIMS. And this is really the body of this entire talk relative to the detailed requirements around ISO 17025. Lastly here, I do want to point out, we're not focused on LabVantage on this talk. We did say that we work there, but ISO 9001 is a certification, and we do have that at LabVantage. Specifically, we are certified for the design, installation, and provision of laboratory software, which doesn't just mean we know how to build software. It means we know how to test it and validate it. We know how to make sure that we have a process for fixing bugs. And most importantly, we have a process for formally documenting everything and doing software releases. So now I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Dr. Robin McDonald, who will take us through this next section.
Today, we're going to focus on two sections of the 17025 requirements document. Section 6, resource requirements, and Section 7, process requirements. These are two sections where your laboratory information management system can really add value in meeting your accreditation standards. Section 6.2 focuses on personnel. Control of access is always one of the first topics that comes up in discussions about using a laboratory information management system. Organizations need to control both what users can do in the system, as well as what data they have access to. As you can imagine, this is particularly crucial in forensic laboratories. I was working at the Broward Sheriff's Office Crime Laboratory when Anna Nicole Smith died at the Hard Rock Hotel. Because of the high-profile nature of the decedent, our laboratory took special care to ensure that privacy was maintained and photos from the scene were not leaked to the media. That was back in 2007, and back then many labs did not have extensive LIMS systems. So data and information was much easier to control. So how can we, in today's world of databases that house crime scene images, analytical results, and final reports, and much more, be sure that only those with a need to know have access? You should expect to be able to create roles or job types specific to the needs of your organization. You should also be able to control access based on the section of the laboratory that a person works in, and even get more granular as necessary. You can see an example of that here on the screen, where on the left in this image, we see different job types such as a DNA supervisor, evidence technician, and so forth. And if we were to click on that particular job type and edit it, we should be presented with a list of options to indicate what access that person with that job type has. And you should be able to maybe edit ones that come with your system, but also add new roles that are appropriate to your organization. Another important topic with respect to personnel is analyst certifications. Some might think of this as an authorization to perform work. When hiring a new analyst, even if they have extensive experience in their area of expertise, it's important that they be tested on the analytical methods they will be employing in their new laboratory. One way your LIMS can act as your quality assurance partner is to prevent users from assigning analyses to evidence if they are not certified on that particular test method. It's also very helpful to the quality assurance manager if within the LIMS, they can see a list of training records for all analysts, and also if they can look at a specific test and see everyone who's trained or certified on that particular test. This slide shows an example of looking at the certifications by analyst. Here on the left, we have chosen Sheldon, and upon clicking the analyst training button, we see a list of all of the analyses that Sheldon Cooper is certified to perform. Notice there can also be a period of expiration. and you can even set a grace period. This would be important if you have requirements that a person be recertified periodically. Let's talk about the facility and environmental conditions. You should expect to be able to interface to pertinent environmental systems such as freezers and refrigerators used for biological samples, and to be notified if they aren't within specifications. Depending on the work done at your lab, you may even want to schedule taking environmental samples from around the facility. And of course, anything measured can be tracked to signal users when a value is out of specifications or even trending in that direction. This is a really important topic. Section 6.4 talks about equipment. Instruments fall under this category as well. Keeping 3-ring binders filled with instrument performance checks, calibration records, and maintenance and repair logs not only takes up a lot of physical space, but can also lead to missing records when a sheet comes loose. Imagine the ability to define all of the types of instruments and equipment that you use, such as balances, GC mass specs, infrared spectrometers, and so on. And then further, to create unique identifiers for each specific piece of equipment and define the expected specifications for that instrument. For example, what the retention time is for the components of a resolution test mix, as well as the relative abundance of each. Then being able to capture all of that data as well as your calibrations, routine maintenance, and repair records. If you do, assessment day becomes much less stressful, and the amount of money spent on reams of paper drops significantly. I remember when I managed the drug chemistry unit, filling banker box after banker box with data, and then needing to retrieve between 1 to 5 years worth of those boxes when going through an assessment, when it all could have been maintained electronically in one place. As I mentioned, these activities can be scheduled, which is really helpful because people get busy and it's easy to forget that it's time to do a tune or change some pump oil or whatever that looks like for a given piece of equipment. Your LIMS can maintain that schedule and create a work order when it's time to conduct some activity on the instrument. And when it's successfully completed, the equipment is available until the next time that it's due. And if it's not completed, the instrument could be automatically taken offline. You could even set some wiggle room in by using a grace period. Even when doing daily performance checks, if an instrument does not pass specifications, it can be taken offline to mitigate analysts inadvertently assigning that equipment to a batch of samples, which helps to avoid corrective actions or even the need to correct paperwork. In this image, we see an example of a balance that's specifically identified as BAL101 in the top left. We see that the model is a Denver XP 1500 and the type of instrument is balance. But specifically, the unique identifier is BAL101. And we can see that it is in service and that for the certification required there on the right, it's under a scheduled event so that when it's time, a work order will be generated and the balance would go through its appropriate verification. Another nice feature of a LIMS is the ability to track the usage of specific pieces of equipment. Doing so may let you choose to do calibration or service events based on a certain number of uses rather than, say, 5 weeks or months or some other time period. If you've purchased the equipment with a grant, it also helps you to justify the value brought by the instrument that grant provided. Knowing the usage can also help you justify the purchase of additional equipment if you find that the equipment is being heavily utilized. In this slide, we see how that might look in your software. I can see here that we've decided to track the usage and to set some parameters around that. We also see down at the bottom a certification schedule that's been set up to say that we want to check the 1, the 10, and the 100 gram weights. and we want to do it every 8 hours and so forth. Now, this is just one example of how you could set a plan around each piece of equipment or instrument for its routine checks as well as calibration and maintenance. Also, if you note in the top of the image where it says test connection, that would be used to test the connection to the piece of equipment if you've decided to interface that piece of equipment and capture the readings directly from the equipment into the LIMS rather than a person needing to type those values. Also important to note are the two buttons on the far right that make available or make unavailable the piece of equipment. This is important, as I mentioned earlier, so that if an instrument does not pass its specifications, it can be taken offline, corrected, and then brought back online. This image just gives us a little better look at one of those work orders. Again, this is the Denver XP 1500, and we see that the work order has been created. So when that happens, you might expect to see in your LIMS a place like you see here with that second pink dot where you would find all of the equipment that's pending certifications. And once it's done, if you choose, you might even want it to go through a review process where someone else checks the data that's been entered and maybe even checks attachments that may have been uploaded, like a tune report or something like that. So these things can be very flexible and really help you manage all of the activities around your equipment in such a way that it's all stored in the database. And like I said earlier, when an assessor comes in and sees how rigorously you're managing the quality checks around your equipment, they're going to feel very comfortable that everything is in order. A lot of what we've been talking about touches on the topic we see here in section 6.5 of metrological traceability. The LIMS is just one way that makes it easy for the lab to comply with this requirement by scheduling these events and having it all documented. Let's move on to talking about section 6.6, externally provided products and services. The big topic under this section would be consumables. Every laboratory needs the ability to track and monitor their laboratory consumables, which are things like reagents, QC samples, and standards. This applies whether the consumable is something that you've created in-house or purchased from a manufacturer such as Fisher or Sigma. You would want to be able to categorize your materials such as acids, bases, buffers, solvents, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, you're going to want to identify the various types of consumables. Let's take for example, methanol. So this material type almost acts as a template so that you can set up a lot of information once and it will be applicable every time you receive a new lot of that material. For example, you might want to document the NFPA safety symbols or storage conditions, or maybe some physical parameters like density or boiling point. All of that stuff is applicable to methanol, regardless of which lot you're actually talking about. Getting more granular, you need to be able to fully trace every single bottle of that methanol that you receive into your laboratory. Not only do you need to know the manufacturer's lot number, but every bottle needs to have a unique identifier in case one of those bottles becomes contaminated. When you receive your material into the laboratory, you're also likely going to be setting an expiration date, and you also might want to put this new material through some sort of quality check before you make it available for use in casework. And when we talk about the in-house reagents, in other words, those things we've prepared ourselves, we not only need to track the lot number of the newly prepared material, but also the lot number of every single component that went into that material. So you can use your LIMS to set rules around what's required for each material type, and it can track the newly received or created lots and then queue them up for further testing and approval prior to being put into casework. These images really help illustrate the value of having your quality management system as an integral part of your laboratory information management system. When conducting an analysis on a piece of evidence, the ability to link the required consumables and instruments to that analysis enables the user to choose the specific lot numbers or the specific piece of equipment at the time they're doing the test. And that traceability is then maintained within the database. And because of that, if it comes to your attention that there was a problem with one of the consumables or a piece of equipment, you would be able to trace back what other cases and exhibits were analyzed with that same material or equipment. Anytime one of these situations arises during an assessment, the first question asked is, could other casework have been affected? And by using the LIMS to document the consumables and instruments linked to the analysis conducted on the exhibit, it's a simple matter to go into the system and pull that list out. The other thing illustrated in the second image is that in addition to tracking the lot numbers as well as the specific container used, you can also set default amounts of the various consumables used when conducting the test. That enables the system to decrement that amount of material from the supply. Ultimately, by being able to track the amount of the material that remains, you can set up notifications when materials need to be reordered. Okay, back to you, Bob.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate all that great information. Now we're going to talk about process requirements, which are covered in ISO 17025, Section 7. And the first topic, and probably the most important, if you don't get this one right, it's going to be hard to do a lot of things correctly in the lab, and that is the validation of your methods, verifying them, validating them, storing them, etc. You must store procedures, appropriate versions of procedures in a manner. You must store procedures, appropriate versions of procedures, in a manner that makes them readily available to the analysts and examiners that are doing the work on the bench. And these procedures have to address sampling, handling, transport, storage, and preparation of all of the items to be tested. And all of those items, of course, are subject to the QA measures we're talking about. You have to be able to manage any deviations. And again, to reiterate, these are all things that will be done for you in a comprehensive forensic information management system. Managing deviations using CAPA, which is corrective and preventive actions. You have to also be able to define testing and calibration methods and make sure the latest versions of them are available. Recording test results at the time of generation. And timestamps are also important. The system must automatically apply time and date stamps, as well as who is the examiner that did the work, and those need to be things that are not changeable. When we get into statistical considerations, we're talking about things like detection limits, sensitivity limits, linearity, limits of reproducibility, and then also calculations. I alluded to calculations a little bit at the very beginning. Very, very hard to validate applications such as Excel when doing important calculations that feed into your forensic data stream. So a FIMS, of course, that is comprehensive and quality compliant will do these validation steps for you, including the locking down of the calculations such that not any person who accesses the system can edit those calculations. Also important is statistical process control. I think everyone's familiar with Levy-Jennings rules and how they get applied to a control chart. And then interfacing to instruments really is not just an efficiency consideration, but also absolutely a quality consideration, because the data transferred to and from the instrument is not going to have quality issues, whereas an analyst typing in numbers can most certainly type things in incorrectly. So now we're going to talk about handling of test or calibration items. This is section 7.4 of the standard. A FIMS will implement barcodes, which not only adds a lot to the efficiency of your work, but also the correctness. If you scan a barcode, you're not typing in an incorrect number. Tracking storage locations of samples. You can also do inventories to make sure that things actually are stored where they are supposed to be stored. Uniquely identifying samples. This is very important because first off, those unique identifications are not going to change. And secondly, they're only going to exist as one critical identifier for the sample. There will not be 3 different steps in the process that involve identifying the sample a different way from the previous step in the process. So the sample has one ID, identified early, and stays the same throughout. Documenting and recording abnormalities. This is again a reference to the kappa that we talked about a couple of slides ago. And lastly, again, viewing sample handling instructions, procedures, methodologies, et cetera, that are always available to the examiner. And these do need to include things like conditional storage conditions that are associated with the sample. Section 7.5 is technical records, and this really is simply a reference to the fact that the FIMS does maintain all of your data within a centralized database, put there one time, doesn't have to be entered a second time, and does include an audit trail that shows who made changes, why they made changes, and when they made those changes. This is also, by the way, about as secure of a process you can have in retaining your critical records, meaning, of course, that you're using one system that is secured in one location. 7.6 is evaluation of measurement uncertainty. And again, we're talking about applying calculations to data in the database, as well as statistical process control, both of which are key and very normal aspects of a comprehensive FIMS. Validity of results. These are the actual analytical results that are ready to be sent out with examiner notes, et cetera. You want to be able to trend those results to make sure that you're not having a problem with a particular instrument, not having a problem with a particular examiner, and those kinds of things. Replicating tests or calibrations using the same or different methods. Again, happens all day, every day with a FIMS. And then, of course, kappa, this might be our third reference to it, but absolutely critical. When you get audited or reviewed by an assessor, this program is going to be looked at. And not just is the program solid, but are you executing on the program the way that you said you're going to execute it? Other statistical analysis of results, a FIMS system that's comprehensive is going to give you a lot of analytics capabilities to not just do statistical process control, but also perhaps to look at your data across forensic cases to be able to make prescriptive and predictive decisions for the future. And then lastly, of course, controlling the reference materials that you use in the laboratory. So these are going to be your standards, the working standards that you create from those source standards, and so on, ensuring that they come from legitimate sources, that they were validated, and that they stay in control and are not used beyond expiration dates. This is a couple of screenshots from the LabVantage system that really gives us a good example of what we were talking about when I talked about kappa and conforming to the standard around making sure that you're doing compliance via corrective and preventive actions. Up top here is a look at how you actually create an incident and put in a lot of information about the incident, where it happened, a general explanation, how severe it is, whether an investigation is required. And then, of course, this second screen here shows us the action plan that was established and is connected to the incident that's established over here or created over here. Don't always have to have an action plan, but in most cases it's going to be required because the issue is severe enough to warrant an action plan, but it's always readily available right here from the screen where you created the incident. Okay, let's talk about reporting of results. We want to be able to offer examiner reports and calibration certificates that are completely configurable. And this means a couple of things. Not only does it mean configuring out of the box reports that the FIMS gives you, but it also needs to give you the ability to create new reports based on your organization's needs. You also need to be able to report the deviations from any of the quality focused activities, including test methods that are required by the standard. And then, of course, in the forensic world, uniquely defining us from a lot of other laboratories is that we have examiner notes. The professional laboratory analyst who generates the data offers his or her opinion of what that data actually means. Actually is far more than an opinion. It is a trained and educated examiner's knowledge about what that data actually means, and perhaps it will be used in court later on as the case proceeds. Lastly, you need to be able to amend reports for a number of different reasons, including more data was submitted, more evidence was submitted, or it was determined that something had to be rerun later. Non-conforming work is section 7.2. This one talks about creating, managing, and tracking the work. Again, it's CAPA. It needs to be followed per your written procedure, including all of the documentation that we showed on a couple of screens ago with a couple of system screenshots. And here's a look at some statistical process control that is available in this particular FIMS. Again, Levy-Jennings, control chart, warning limits, control limits, lots of things that are not only look nice and are easy to read, but really give you the ability to quickly identify a potential quality problem. Section 7.11 talks about control of data and information management. These are pretty much as stated here. You want to be able to control access to the data. You need role-based user groups so that I can only look at data that pertains to the particular job function that I have. You need to be able to protect the data from unauthorized access, whether you're using the comprehensive FIMS itself or a portal that is available to your external agents. You must make sure that it's secure, and there are lots of different security policies that are applied. You also need to have online user manuals available so that people can work effectively from within the system. It's not training, but it is a refresher to any and all of the training that you've done as you're actually doing work. And then lastly, a full audit trail that allows you to capture any changes that are made to data. So lastly, we're going to close out with just a quick mention of some of the other applicable standards. Dr. McDonald and I today focused on ISO 17025. There certainly are other standards coming from the FBI, for example. And then the American Board of Forensic Toxicology is another example. These standards all overlap a lot with ISO 17025, but they get into more detail in the specific areas that they cover. So thank you, everybody, for your time and your attention. And Dr. McDonald and I certainly appreciate your interest in this topic, and we look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you for such an informative presentation. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found directly below the video player. And our first question is, what is the most difficult aspect of quality compliance?
That's a good question. When I was in the laboratory, my experience was that the most difficult part of quality compliance was having all of those documents spread amongst so many different systems, including a number of 3-ring binders. So when it was time to go through an assessment, we spent a lot of time preparing by going through the laboratory and pulling training records and instrument validations and things like that, and bring them all into a conference room. So that part is not only time consuming, but it's also very stressful, because you're wondering, with all of these binders and so forth, did something get lost? And I think from my experience, that was the most difficult part, was just kind of consolidating all of that data to be ready for the assessment.
Wow, fantastic information. Our next question is, what are the most common problems auditors find?
This is kind of funny, because it turns out that the most common corrective actions that are written when going through an assessment have to do with the laboratory, or the analyst within the laboratory, not following their own written quality requirements. So of course, the regulating bodies and documents such as ISO 17025 give guidance on what the laboratory needs to meet, what the criteria are, but the way that they do that is very flexible. And oftentimes organizations write their own internal documents so restrictive that they often violate their own written policies. For example, if I were to write that the GC mass spec needs to be tuned on the 3rd of every month. Well, if the 3rd happens to fall on a Saturday or Sunday, I've automatically violated my own written procedures. So that's where people need to be careful, is not to paint themselves into a corner when writing their own procedures to comply with the governing bodies.
Excellent. Thank you for that answer. Let's get to the next question. What is the process a lab must follow to address a nonconformance?
The really important part about addressing a nonconformance is that you can't just jump in and start to fix things. First, it has to be documented that there is a nonconformance. And of course, if it's something that's a danger, you can take some initial mitigating actions that no further harm is caused. However, from that point on, you have to do a very rigorous root cause analysis. And after that root cause analysis is conducted and signed off on, the next step is that an action plan is drafted. And that action plan also has to go through an approval process. This is really important to make it so that in trying to address the problem, that the users aren't maybe missing what the real root of the problem was. And then finally, a monitoring step after the solution has been implemented to make sure that whatever that action plan stated and was put into place, that it actually did resolve the problem.
Wow, yes, very super informative. Let's move to the next question. Can a LIMS interface to an existing quality management system? Great question.
It absolutely can, but it's unnecessary. The ideal approach is to buy a comprehensive FIMS, or forensic information management system, that already has all of the quality compliance features in it. If you have more than one system, in other words, a separate quality management system, number one, you're paying for 2 systems. Number 2, you have to pay for, build, and maintain an interface between the 2 systems. That's really a concern for 2 reasons. Number 1, you need resources to maintain that interface, and an interface can impose a security concern. The third reason is users have to learn and log in to more than one system on a regular basis.
Great answer. Let's get to the next question. Why not just purchase an off-the-shelf quality management system?
Well, you can, but the simple truth is it's just a small subset of what the comprehensive FIMS will do. So if you do not need functions beyond quality management, or if your budget is extremely restricted, that is something that you can do. But largely based on the answer I gave to the previous question, it's really not the best way to operate.
So true. And our final question of the day, can the quality management features be added as a separate phase to a LIMS implementation project?
Yes, definitely. A lot of labs actually choose a multi-phase approach to implementations for various reasons. So sometimes it's budget related. Sometimes they only want to, implement the system unit by unit or department by department. But certainly, quality assurance can also be kind of a module, if you will, that can be implemented as its own phase.
Fantastic. Thank you for that answer, Bob. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for attending and for participating in today's event. I would also like to thank our sponsor, LabVantage Solutions, for making today's educational webcast possible. We would like to ask everyone in the audience to participate in a brief survey. This survey will populate automatically after today's presentation has ended. You will receive an email alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.